All right, so today we're going to talk about kind of the downfall of the presidency in the 1970s. And it begins with Watergate and continues through the Ford administration after Nixon's resignation. And then Carter gradually becomes weaker and weaker. And we're going to see the reestablishment of the presidency under Reagan in the 1980s. But today we're going to talk about Watergate, we'll talk about President Ford, and then the failures of the Carter administration. And what I always say to my students is that the presidency really magnifies character traits. And I guess any powerful position really. So, you know, if you are prone to insecurities, you know, the presidency is going to magnify that. If you're prone to weaknesses, the presidency is going to magnify that as well. And I think your positive traits also. And that's what we see with both Nixon and Carter especially. Nixon's paranoia is going to really kind of come to the front, and Carter's kind of quibbling decision-making style is going to come to the fore as well. So we're going to talk about Nixon presidency getting bogged down, the main events of his 72 election, how that leads to the Watergate scandal, and how Ford, when he becomes president, addresses that. So the main events in the presidential election of 1972. I think we need to understand that, you know, Nixon's opponent in 72 was never really that much of a threat, but he was concerned about winning the election, and his team actually winds up using illegal methods to do so. First, his advisors create a group that comes to be known as the Plumbers. And these guys' jobs are to respond to leaks of information and to investigate political enemies on the Nixon. They actually had a political enemies list, Nixon did. So in 71, Plumbers first attacked Daniel Ellsberg. And this is the guy who leaked the Pentagon Papers that basically showed that the government had been lying about the Vietnam for years and years. But basically, the Plumbers actually committed a breaking and entering into Ellsberg's psychiatrist's office to try to find information to discredit him. In early 1972, the Plumbers also decided to break into the offices of the Democratic National Committee at the Watergate Hotel to collect information about the Democratic strategy for 1972. Again, you know, it's not as if Nixon was in huge danger of being defeated by McGovern in 72, but this shows kind of the paranoid mindset of Nixon and his team. So anyway, at the Watergate, 5 men are arrested during the break-in. Barely makes news, barely creates a ripple, but Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein of the Washington Post, writers for the Washington Post, begin to investigate the break-in, and they continue to push the story and get more and more information. So they reported that it was part of a widespread spying effort by the Nixon campaign, and still it didn't pick up steam until after the election, which Nixon won in an overwhelming fashion. And there's a picture. Here you have Carl Bernstein, and there's Bob Woodward, both of whom are working journalists today. Bob Woodward specifically, especially prolific today. So basically, after the election, many of the men, it comes to be found out that several of the men have ties to the White House or to the committee to reelect the president. So people started wondering if Nixon knew about the wrongdoing. Nixon ordered an investigation into the scandal, but at the same time the White House was leading a cover-up. Several men resigned, and many of the Republicans were satisfied, but Democrats demanded an independent investigator, and that was Archibald Cox. He was appointed by the Department of Justice. So Senate also began its own investigation, and former Attorney General under Nixon, John Dean, talked before the committee and said that Nixon had known about the cover-up and Watergate itself. This happened when Alexander Butterfield also comes out and says that Nixon's recorded all of these conversations. Nixon said he wasn't going to give up the tapes, and basically argued that executive privilege gave him the right to withhold those tapes. Investigators said that's not true, and it winds up going to the Supreme Court. So the investigators used subpoenas demanding the tapes. So in response, Nixon basically executed what becomes known as the Saturday Night Massacre. He directs his attorney general to fire the special prosecutor, the independent prosecutor, Archibald Cox. Richardson says, no, I'm not going to do that. It's a violation. That's playing politics with a special prosecutor role. Nixon says, okay, I'm going to either do it or else. So Richardson quits rather than fire Cox. Then he orders Richardson's assistant to fire Cox, who refuses and resigns as well. And finally, the third-ranking official in the Justice Department fires Cox. And the public kind of sees Nixon as overstepping his authority as president. So the crisis continued. Nixon continued to deny involvement. Confidence, as more and more stories come out, confidence in the president plummets. And the White House reveals, finally, they're forced to release the tapes by the Supreme Court. And the White House reveals that there's an 18-minute portion of the tape that had miraculously been erased. There were calls for impeachment. Nixon released transcripts of the tapes, which is a printed copy of what was said. Finally, the Supreme Court rules that Nixon has to hand over the tapes. And at the same time, the House Judiciary Committee votes to recommend impeachment. However, before the full Senate can vote, before the House and the Senate can vote on impeachment, for the House can bring charges of impeachment, and the Senate can vote, Nixon resigns the presidency in 1974, and basically Gerald Ford becomes the president. He resigns rather than face impeachment. And this is, of course, political cartoons showing the idea that the missing tapes must have shown something incriminating. So Ford becomes president. Spiro T. Agnew, who was the vice president before, had resigned because he had been charged with cheating on his taxes and taking bribes. So Gerald Ford had been appointed the new vice president. He was the Republican leader in the House of Representatives. So he becomes president. He was the vice president appointed at the time, and he becomes president when Nixon resigns. Ford is still the only person ever to become president without having been elected either president or vice president, because he was appointed vice president. So Ford turns around and grants a full pardon to Richard Nixon. Now, this caused all kinds of controversy, but he believed it was important to get past it. He says, our long national nightmare is over, was the statement that he made. He tried to cut government spending, but Democratic Congress overruled him a lot of times. Spending bills were being passed against his wishes, against his veto. He carries out Nixon's foreign policy of détente, kept Kissinger as Secretary of State, and he refused to allow Congress refused to allow Ford to take part in Vietnam or Cuba. Basically, Congress takes over a much more powerful role during this time. So after he fulfills the last couple years of Nixon's term, he does run for re-election and wins nomination in the Republican primary over Richard Nixon and faces Jimmy Carter. Now, Jimmy Carter has a reputation as a very honest man, a very honest public servant, and he was an honest man, deep religious faith, seemed like a simple kind of guy, and he promises not to lie to the American people, which is kind of music to the voters' ears. As soon as he is elected, he tries to help the nation heal some of these wounds of the past. For instance, he pardons people who had dodged the draft during Vietnam, people that have gone to Canada and things of that nature. He also tackled problems in the economy and energy and environmental issues. So we'll talk a little more about the things that Carter does in domestic and foreign. All right, so when Carter takes office, he's facing a lot of challenges. Inflation is high, unemployment is high. It's a new economic case known as stagflation, where the economy is not growing, but there's still inflation. So it's a problem. And Carter says that one of the issues is that energy has to be a national priority. He wants to ease independence on foreign oil, which is going to be a statement that you'll hear politicians say over the next 3 or 4 decades. So he wants to develop new energy supplies, loosen government regulation of the oil industry, all those kinds of things. So he asks Americans to conserve energy and promotes the development of alternate energy sources. As a result, the economy added new jobs, but he's unable to stop inflation. In fact, as the economy grows, inflation only picks up. And while Carter's policies did reduce energy independence on foreign oil, it's still because the economy is growing much quicker. It still has a negligible effect. All right, so environmental concerns were important. This is something that Nixon had concerns about and had signed legislation to address, and Carter's going to continue that work. He believed that conserving fuel was one of the best ways to avoid harming the environment, but he also passed the Alaska National Interest Lands Conservation Act, which creates more than 100 million acres. The Arctic National Wildlife Refuge of today was created by this act. However, he sees some massive environmental catastrophes during his administration. 3 Mile Island, a nuclear power plant, has a mishap and releases some radiation into the air. There are concerns that it negatively impact the citizens there. And the idea of nuclear power and developing nuclear power comes up for public debate. People start to question whether it's a good thing or not. Also at Love Canal in New York, a chemical company, chemicals that were dumped by an industrial company began to seep up through the ground in Love Canal or in the neighborhood surrounding Love Canal. You had high rates of birth defects and things of that nature. So this shines a light on the problem of toxic dumping and things of that nature. And if you look back in the 70s and 80s, that's going to be a major concern. The experts warn that although we found this one, there's probably worse things that are existing, and it becomes a focus, a rallying point for environmentalists during this time. All right, so Carter's foreign policy was kind of hit and miss. He didn't have foreign policy experience. He was governor of Georgia when he was elected, and he put human rights at the forefront of his foreign policy. So what happened as a result, a lot of times it was kind of seemed a little all over the place. But Carter promised the human rights to be at the forefront of his foreign policy. He did work to strengthen ties between the Soviet Union and China, so it continues between the U.S. and the Soviet Union and China, so it continues this work that Nixon and Ford had been doing. He gave control of Panama Canal back to Panama, and he also helped Israel and Egypt deal with some of their divisions, and that's going to lead to a major development in foreign policy. So again, human rights. He wanted to base foreign policy on the UN Declaration of Human Rights, that we should uphold the highest standards of treatment of citizens around the world. Carter wrote to Leonid Brezhnev to try to address Soviet civil rights issues. Brezhnev said, well, I think you should mind your own business. They did conclude the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks 2 in 1979, which further limited nuclear weapons, and is the first government to formally recognize the People's Republic of China as the official government of China. It also ended the recognition of the Republic of China on Taiwan. So Panama Canal, again, this was a source of conflict between the two countries. So basically, Carter signs treaties giving the canal back to Panama. The greatest foreign policy achievement of Carter's is he fashions a peace agreement between Menachem Begin and Anwar Sadat of Israel and Egypt, called the Camp David Accords. And this has really actually held up since then. So it's been an important agreement for Mideast peace. Carter is going to be derailed by two major problems, though. Soviets invade Afghanistan in 1979. The U.S. response is very weak. It's only a boycott of the 1980 Olympics. And Iran, the revolution in Iran happens and American hostages are taken during this time. The situation drags on. He sends a failed rescue attempt that doesn't work, and that causes